There we go. Welcome to today's edition of the Carver Talks podcast. I'm going to start off with a quote before I introduce my guest today. This is a quote that this gentleman had a lecture he gave a few years ago, and it always stuck in my mind. I'm going to read the quote. The quote: "Unless democratic habits of thought and actions are part of the fibre of a people, political democracy is insecure. It cannot stand in isolation, and it must be buttressed by the presence of democratic methods in all social relationships." End quote. Now that makes me think. More discreetly, I remember years later, Martin Luther King said there is no civil rights without economic rights. And I think this is sort of generally what we'll talk about today. I think that sort of sums it up in a nutshell. So today we have Andrew Cumbers here today. He's a professor of political economy at the University of Glasgow, but he's now a visiting professor in Bonn, in Germany. Nice to meet you, Andrew. How are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. Great to be here, Eddie. Thanks for inviting me.
No worries. Thanks for taking the time. It's much appreciated. Okay, so we're going to keep this simple. I'm going to start off with a question that I think the best way to get into this, I thought, is once again, I remember one of your lectures, you brought up a poll, and it was about the desire for the UK public to nationalise and bring into public ownership certain things like utilities and stuff like this. And your figures back there were, it was quite high. It was like 70-80% with water, wasn't it? 70% with electric and stuff like that. So I had a look at some polls today just to sort of bring them up to date, and I've looked at a couple of the bigger ones, the YouGov polls, the Ipsy Mori polls, and they all pretty much stand the same. But according to the YouGov poll back in 2017, the desire to nationalize energy companies has risen from 53% in 2017 to 71% in 2024. This pretty much the same with the Ipsy Mori poll. The Ipsy Mori poll was, it sort of ranges between 70 to 80% for railways. And even as you remarked back in your lecture, back when you gave the figures back in 2019, I think it was, even roughly over the years, 50% of people are wanting banks, nationalized. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there seems to be that democratic deficit of what's going on here. When we have what people sort of want and what is the reality. So what is going on here? What is the deficit? Why is this not working out?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and it probably would take more than half an hour to.
Yeah, that's why I asked it, because you can speak a lot, and I won't interrupt.
But I think if we start with public ownership is really, it's one of the things I've been researching now for about 20 odd years. Actually, I started working on that back in the day when I was a member of the Scottish Socialist Party, and I was asked to come up with an idea. We've always believed in public ownership on the left. What would it look like today? So I wrote a paper back in about 2001, and I think hardly anybody read it at the time. It wasn't the mode then. But of course, then we had the financial crisis, and more people began to ask questions about the economy. Then we had the moment of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour leadership, and a lot of public ownership came back on the agenda big time. But the thing that always struck me whenever I've looked at public opinion is how far away public opinion is from sort of political leaderships and elite, particularly centre left, centre right, sort of mainstream political leaderships. Public ownership has always been far more popular amongst the public than it has amongst political leaders or even political representatives, and that for me is quite astounding. I think even when the Corbyn Labour project came to its defeat against Boris Johnson in 2019. Public ownership was massively popular, which was, of course, their policy. And of course, it was so popular that Keir Starmer, famously, when he stood for Labour leadership, made all those pledges about public ownership, which he immediately, once he became leader, of course, dropped. And actually, that level of hypocrisy amongst the political elite is, I think, one of the issues that we face here in our current moment. You have a group of politicians who will say what they think they need for the current moment, and then they think they can ditch it, and everyone will forget what they've said. But I think public ownership has always been more popular amongst the public than it is amongst politicians. And I think even during the days of privatization, from sort of the mid 80s onwards, public ownership still remained popular. But you wouldn't have got that from the media. You wouldn't have got that from the mainstream press, who would always talk about the bad experiences of state ownership. You know, things were terrible under British Rail. And you know, I remember speaking to journalists 20 years later, and they said, well, but British Rail was terrible, wasn't it? The sandwiches were terrible. Well, yeah, well, the sandwiches might have been terrible, but actually under British Rail in the 70s, actually the railways ran relatively well compared to, if you look at them internationally in comparison. And of course, you know, but there was this myth that the public ownership was bureaucratic, it was inefficient. You know, the old way of doing things was very top down. People didn't feel part of it, whether it was energy, whether it was water, whether it was rail or whatever. But I think in the UK we've had this kind of real world experiment in privatization now, which has been a complete failure, as everybody knows, and therefore I think public ownership has only risen in popularity. But the thing I think I always say to people is it's not just enough to bring things back under public ownership. We need a form of public ownership that's democratic and participatory, and that people feel genuine ownership of. And the example I like to give of a kind of public ownership that doesn't really involve the public is the BBC, which of course is publicly owned. It's our public institution. But if you look at the board of governors of the BBC, up until very recently, most of the people appointed to that would have been from the financial sector, or certainly had very little resonance with the real public. And the public itself, even though the BBC is a British, you know, broadcasting corporation, it's always been run on behalf of the public, rather than, except for a brief period, which I'm writing about in a new book I'm doing, for a brief period in the 1970s, when there was a community programming unit and all kinds of interesting innovations to allow people to make their own programs even. But the BBC has always been, for me, it's the kind of exemplar of a kind of state hierarchical run institution on behalf of people rather than run by people. And I think one of the things we were trying to get through with the work we did with John McDonnell and the whole project, the Labour leadership between 2016 and 2019, was to say, well, let's have a very different form of public ownership that's democratically organised and run by run by people and by workers, where they've got a real decision-making voice and real participation in what goes on. And the other thing I think we did that was really different compared perhaps to past Labour policy, when Labour did believe in public ownership back in the 1970s and early 80s, we talked about diverse forms of public ownership. You know, different forms of public ownership will suit different needs. And the good example of that now is the energy sector, for example. You wouldn't want to go back to an energy sector that was completely run by top-down state institutions at the UK level, where it's sort of civil servants and technocrats that make all the decisions. You know, given the nature of the way the energy system's developing and the way we need a very different decentralized system in a post-carbon renewable energy future, it would be very possible to have all kinds of different forms of public ownership, some more community-owned. You can have hybrids between local government and citizen-owned energy companies. Actually, you see that in Denmark and Germany. There's lots of interesting examples there of how public ownership can be run very, very differently. So, I think one of the things we've got to remember here is people, you know, politicians often behave as if people are a bit stupid, or they don't want to know about politics, so they don't want to get involved. But actually, when people realize what politics is about, and it's about the key decisions that affect their lives, it's the running of essential services and so on, of course people want to get involved. They want to participate, and they want to be taken seriously. And to go back to Keir Starmer, you know, people like him who come in, they promise they're going to continue with an agenda that's very popular amongst Labour Party members, and they get elected, and then they drop everything and they do an about turn and say, oh, we don't believe in that sort of stuff. In a way, that does immense damage to politics and democracy. Just that kind of attitude and that kind of behaviour that we saw from Starmer in that respect. So yeah, public ownership has always been very popular, but you wouldn't know it from politicians, you wouldn't know it from the media. There's a kind of and I think that's largely because, you know, dominant politicians and media, they are broadly, I would say, dominated by the interests of business, and increasingly particular kinds of business. Big business, financial sector has immense control over the UK economy and probably the US in a way it doesn't in other countries, for example. But there is a corporate agenda, and a lot of money is spent by corporate lobbying firms. You know, millions and millions of pounds. They've got immense resources to spend on lobbying politicians, and you look at what goes on, for example, within the European Union, European Commission. There's a very good group of people called the Corporate Europe Observatory, which do some fantastic work exposing corporate lobbying. So I think that public ownership has always been very popular, but it very rarely gets into the mainstream of conversation in terms of the dominant media.
Yeah, you got to. Yeah, thanks for bringing out. There's so many points there. So would you be able to go on and describe? I mean, it sounds what you're describing as the economics is driving the political here. So what are the economics at play here? Not just in the UK. I mean, is this a global? I mean, can we call it, like a lot of people do? Can we call it neoliberalism? What is the driving force behind it? Why can't we translate that democratic will into democratic reality?
Well, I think the power of the mainstream media, despite the growth of social media, is immense, of course, in always putting forward a sort of a particular form of common sense, inverted commas, that everybody kind of is expected to sign up to. And it's always remarkable for me, how many people do develop alternative opinions and alternative views about the economy, given how it is difficult to puncture things through. With the growth of social media, of course, some of us were very hopeful back in the late 90s, early 2000s, that social media was going to open up democratic spaces for people, and we see where that's gone. It doesn't mean that these things are always going to be captured by corporate elites, but clearly, I think one of the big problems is here the corporate capture of both what they call the legacy media, the mainstream media, and social media is evident, and it's all around us, and I think I mean, obviously the examples of people like Elon Musk come to the fore here, or Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, and the sort of things that they're going on, and the whole kind of deference to the whole Trump agenda is obviously very disturbing and very worrying from the point of view of democracy more broadly. But I think that's kind of that's a kind of extreme. We've got to an extreme situation with all that. But I think even without Trump, even without the rise of right wing autocracies, we should be querying the extent to which media is dominated by corporate interests, by big business interests. If you look at the newspapers and who owns the newspapers, there's a whole set of important questions and issues to do with democratizing media spaces. If we're talking about social media, and again, the genie is maybe out of the bottle here, but I think quite a while ago, media scholars were warning about allowing a few people to take over and dominate the digital media world, and how that's totally unregulated, and maybe I mean, you can see countries beginning to try and regulate that. The ones that seem to have the most success in regulating social media seem to be the more autocratic ones, interestingly, which China or whatever, and that's obviously disturbing as well. But I think democratizing the media and having that as an important issue is clearly important. And obviously, a much better set of safeguards and regulation over corporations and how they can interfere in politics, I think, is also very, very important. But if we go back to the economy, I think we need to ask bigger questions about how we run our economy, who controls, who owns the economy. And this is why public ownership is so popular, because it's saying, well, actually, we think that there are parts of the economy that shouldn't just be left to private interests to run things, to decide. Because if you allow the economy to be run by private interests, those private interests, they don't just control the economy in the here and now. They actually control investment decisions. They're the ones who do in the 5-year planning. I mean, if you look at how most industries, most markets work, it's big corporations doing sort of 5-year strategic plans on things. It's not a nice sort of perfectly competitive market where there's lots of firms. You've got corporate oligopolies running most markets, whether it's energy or whether it's food or whatever. So there's legitimate questions about how we can have different forms of democratic participation and engagement in different parts of the economy. And that's not to say that everything has to be collectively owned by the state. We saw that's not a good model either. But we do necessarily need more democratic forms of diverse hybrid forms of collective ownership, and that's something I've argued for quite a while in different books and different debates, which I think is very, very important as well.
Yeah, Andrew. One of the that always concerns me, or I like to think about, is, and like you said, you mentioned the tech billionaires and stuff, and they do this with information, and the pharmaceutical companies will do it with drugs and stuff, is they make something that's becoming more and more abundant, more and more scarce. So, you know, would you agree with that? I mean, do you think once again this is like this to me seems to be like a driving force in you literally, you know, in a place of abundance, things are becoming scarce, and that seems to be the economic model that's driving us into what I would call, you know, irrational futures, you know, troublesome futures.
Definitely, and I think the best example for that was during the pandemic, of course, when you know there was a big argument that that we should forego patents and give drugs and so on to countries in the global south, you know, at a much, you know, at a lower cost price, and of course that was blocked by a lot of countries, and not surprisingly, the countries in Europe and North America that had the big pharma companies that wanted to keep their profits flowing during the pandemic, and you know that was a good example of that, you know. But you see that in, you know, in a lot of markets where you know, it's corporate profitability that drives how that market works, rather than sort of social need or economic need of you know the broader population. So I guess we got to ask. For me, it always comes back to the big question: what's in the common and good, and what's the relationship between the common good here in different parts of the economy, different kinds of investment decisions, and you know the private interests or the appropriation of wealth by private interests. And you mentioned banking, and I think more and more people are realizing that, you know, a bit like digital economy, banking is too important to be left in private hands. You know, and if you, I mean, Germany, where I'm living at the moment, they've got an amazing system of public banks at all these different levels. I mean, they don't always function very well. I would say that the public banks in Germany, but nevertheless, they're there and they do invest. I mean, if you look at the renewable energy revolution in Germany, the creation of community cooperatives, that was facilitated by, you know, local public and local cooperative banks, which, you know, Germany has this kind of whole ecosystem of collective public banks, which is very powerful. The US, interestingly, there's a movement to create more public banks in the US, and that came out at the end of the financial crisis when, you know, we had the Occupy movement. You know, people were protesting, you know, anti-Wall Street and so on, and that kind of died away after a while, as these protests often do. And then a lot of people came out of that and thought, well, what do we do now? And out of that came this public banking movement and say, well, actually, we need to challenge the whole structure on which finance runs. And now there's, you know, there are massive campaigns in the US now to create public banks. California passed a law a couple of years ago at the state level to allow, you know, cities and towns to create their own public banks. I mean, fascinating stuff. And that, you know, we need more of that, really. You know, actually, during the whole Corbyn-McDonnell leadership of the Labour Party, there was a big discussion about public banks and creating regional public banks. Now, that's of course completely gone by the wayside with Starmer and Reeves, who are kind of, you know, they're a kind of they're a sort of Tory party disguise, really, aren't they? But nevertheless, that idea that you get these regional public banks that would be the kind of key institutions in any region, or in Scotland, a proper public bank for Scotland that actually funds long-term development projects. Germany, again, going back to Germany is a good example. It has a federal level bank called the KfW, which has a certain remit to fund environmental projects. You know, and it spends billions on environmental projects. So they do things like they provide finance for individual households at a kind of low interest rates to switch to, you know, away from gas boilers to heat pumps and so on. But, you know, they do much broader projects as well. So imagine if we had those kind of public bank and those kind of institutions, public banks that were run in a particular kind of way, where it would be, you know, workers, citizens, users were on the boards to say, well, actually, we will set the five-year plan, the strategic agenda, and then we'll employ the right people who know how to run a bank to run the bank. But we the people will, as part of that public banking governance, we will set the longer term goals. You know, so that, I mean, that's the sort of thinking I think that we would need and would appeal. And you know, I remember during the independence debate in Scotland back in 2014. You know, I mean, it was a fascinating time to be in Scotland, and you saw people educate themselves about how an economy works and what would be the institutions that we would need in an independent Scotland. Now, I think, you know, late Alex Salmond, he was probably in this political centre ground a bit too much for some people. I mean, I think they had a very cautious approach in some ways. But there was a much more radical independence movement that developed, of course, that was talking about more radical solutions, how we would, you know, have public ownership of energy in Scotland, how we might create our own banking institutions and infrastructure, how could we really realise community ownership of things, how do we revive the Highlands and so on. And again, I mean, the Scottish government has done some really good stuff. They, not so much at the moment, but in the past they've had community. There's been a community agenda. There is a well-being agenda now. There's a community wealth building agenda. I mean, I think a lot of these the Scottish government perhaps pays lip service to rather than develops it more fully. But nevertheless, those ideas are out there. I think that's for me is a frustration of the current moment. Is there's a lot of good alternative thinking out there around these ideas, but it gets blocked or locked out of national policy making or higher level policy making. But you see some good examples at the local level of really interesting democratic experiments in running an economy.
I couldn't agree with you more. Than you just practically described probably the main part of my independence journey for the last several years. We've been talking about there with the S&P. I remember the days of the Scottish Investment Bank and stuff, and sadly, I think they haven't delivered at all. And I think actually my own personal opinion is that maybe people expected too much from their elected leaders in the S&P and stuff. But I really do put a lot of blame, and they didn't follow through. I think they had a lot of movement. They literally had a lot of democratic power behind them to create change, and I think they failed miserably. But aside from that, this was going to get because that helps me. I can get onto the second question that I want to ask you, and that's basically is when given the geopolitical picture, given how we're speaking about the economics that neoliberalism driving our economics and stuff. So what would we need? What would you say would be the minimum requirements for an independent Scotland within that? Well, what can we do to make a robust economy, to make it stable and sustainable? I mean, you talked about, I like the way you go on about lots of different things rather than just nationalize, because I think that's problematic, and it's too easy as well, I think, for the electorate, in my opinion, because it just means you're just deferring. I'll just nationalize it then, and then you don't have to. I don't do politics, as where the more people get involved and engaged in it, like you said, I think if you have a more multi sort of polar aspect of it, it sounds to me. Could you describe a little bit more about that and how you would see?
Yeah, well, I think in a world where you imagine you did have an independent Scotland, or you had a kind of a left of centre leadership. I mean, we have to live in the world that we live in, not the world that the utopian world we want. But that doesn't mean we don't have utopian dreams and we don't have a vision for where we want to go. And I think a lot of politicians come unstuck because they don't have a vision. And I think I wasn't a massive fan of Alex Salmond, for example, but you probably had, unlike a lot of subsequent leaders, he probably had a vision of what he imagined, and he knew his economics. That was his background, wasn't it? So I mean, he was probably a bit more too middle of the road for my liking. But I think you'd have to start off with actually what is a doable pragmatic socialism. There was a guy who was actually professor of, I think he was Eastern European studies, but he was a guy called Alex Nove at the University of Glasgow many years ago, and he wrote a book called the Economics of Feasible Socialism, I think it was called. And he was arguing for a mixed economy, and he was basically learning. I mean, his background was very interesting. I think his parents were I think they were Russian emigres from the 1920s. I think, I'm not sure they were Mensheviks or whatever, but anyway. But he came from that interesting background, and his book was very interesting because he said actually there's a lot of things that the Soviet Union got right in certain sectors. That they knew how to do central planning for kind of basic industries, iron, steel, energy, these kind of things. Those things should be centrally planned on a particular level. But they made a mess of consumer goods markets. Fitting shoes, individual shoes and so on. So I think I take Alex Nove's point about we've got to have what's feasible and what's pragmatic. And the thing you would probably want to do, I mean, the whole point about independence is self-government. And self-government means self-government of the economy as well as self-government of the broader polity and society. And I think if you look at Norway, for example, when it became independent only in 1900 or so on from Sweden. And they were very careful in their relations with foreign companies over time. They had kind of they realized they had to deal with foreign companies, but they would do things like, well, okay, we'll deal with foreign companies, but we'll have an infant industry strategy, or we'll have a technology transfer strategy where we deal with foreign companies, but we insist on certain things happening here and transferring technology over to our own and so on. And you can imagine in independent Scotland, you can't cut yourself off from the rest of the world. That was the kind of fallacy of a kind of left Brexit. And I used to have arguments with friends of mine, about who said, "Oh, we could have a Lexit," and I said, "Well, I'm not sure what I'm not sure that really works. We in an interconnected global economy, if you don't want disaster, then you need to think about what would be feasible. And I think it would be, I mean, things like the Scottish National Investment Bank was a great idea, but what did they do? They got someone to run it from the private sector who came from a corporate, I think it was a guy from Tesco Bank or whatever who was the first person that came in. That's the wrong kind of person. If you're going to have a public bank, you don't want it to be run on a commercial basis. You want it to be run for social, I would argue, for ecological value purposes. That's not to say you shouldn't still have an effective, well-run, efficient bank, but the whole mission's got to be different. And I think for an independent Scotland or Scotland that wants to do things slightly differently, and I was one of those people that said, well, actually, why doesn't the Scottish government, with the powers it has, start to do things very differently? And there was, they moved a little bit in that direction. The whole community agenda that was being developed, setting up their own banks. But again, you don't then get commercial people to come in and run things that should be run for public value or in the common good. So I think you can begin to start upsetting institutions. And I think you probably would need your own currency, or you certainly need independence from Westminster. I mean, that was always a big debate, wasn't it, during the independence? But I mean, countries do create their own currencies all the time, and there were ways and means which that could have been done. I think I talked to you in a previous conversation. Slovenia was a very good example in the 1990s that created its own currency in a much worse situation. The breakup of the former Yugoslavia and loss of all its markets in Eastern Europe. The country still managed to create a currency in a relatively difficult crisis situation. So I think those kind of things, you need your own institutions, and you need to begin to run them democratically, and introduce good democratic stakeholder bodies to run these things. So I think you need to be doing things incrementally. You can't. It's not just one big leap into the unknown, as it were. But I think being pragmatic about what you do and how you get there, and recognizing that you'd have to deal with big business and corporates. You can't wish it away. One of the things I liked about John McDonnell when he was the Chancellor Party, he was chatting to the financial people who would listen to him. In preparation for government. It never happened. But I think there was a recognition there that you've got to live in the world that we live in, but you can still do progressive, radical things. But you just that needs to be tempered by the the realities of what's possible. That's sort of politics of the feasible, isn't it?
Yeah, politics of the feasible. Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to leave it there, Andrew, because I know you have a busy schedule. But you have said that you'll come back again sometime. That would be great. I really look forward to that, because we could discuss this maybe a bit further and some other things. We'll keep it simple.
Oh, great.
I'll stay in touch, Andrew, and thanks again for that. Very, very informative, and we look forward again to unpacking a little bit more next time we speak.
That would be great, and thanks for having me on.
No worries. You take care, Andrew. All the best. Thank you very much.